Gunshots, killings, protests, and the rush to flee Kabul. Chaotic scenes have been witnessed in Afghanistan since the 15th of August when the Taliban breached the gates of the Kabul city. While a sitting president fled the country and his government helplessly surrendered, once earlier, the Taliban had been able to seize power in Afghanistan before the US declared its war on terrorism and dislodged them into the wilderness. However, the thirst to conquer Afghanistan has been witnessed for centuries. Infamously called the graveyard of empires, Afghanistan has been a difficult country to govern. History tells us that since the 11th century BC, different empires and forces have tried to gain control over Afghanistan. Empire after empire, nation after nation has failed to pacify the landlocked country, even if sometimes those empires won some initial battles and made inroads into the region. It is one of the world's fiercest battlegrounds and a complex geopolitical playground which makes it difficult to govern. The primary aspect is its location. It is situated on the mainland route between Iran, Central Asia and India. Secondly, its lawlessness, given the frequency of invasion and the prevalence of tribalism. Thirdly, the physical terrain of Afghanistan makes conquest and rule extremely difficult. Afghanistan is dominated by some of the highest and most jagged mountains in the world, including the Hindu Kush, which dominates the country and runs through the center and south of the country, as well as the Pamir Mountains in the east. As US and NATO allies mark their final withdrawal from Afghanistan, the US is by no means the first nation to have departed amid the violence and chaos before eventually pulling out. The British learned the hard way in their 1839 to 1842 war in Afghanistan. The first Anglo-Afghan war saw a retreating British army routed and massacred by Afghans in 1842, with 4,500 troops lost along with approximately 12,000 civilians. While the Second Anglo-Afghan War went better for the British between 1878 and 1880, the Third Anglo-Afghan War in 1919 saw the Central Asian nation win back its independence. Soviet Union was taught this bitter lesson during its decade-long invasion from 1979 to 1989 and had to beat a hasty retreat. Both the British and Russians have learned that while it is possible to conquer territory in Afghanistan temporarily and defeat Afghans militarily in open battle, it is virtually impossible to hold the region down for very long when it is filled with guerrillas, tribes and castles that can constantly weigh down a foreign power. And 2 decades after its occupation of the US supported by NATO troops, the Western allies too suffered tremendous losses and withdrew. Let's take a look at Afghanistan over the last 100 years. The first ruler we come across was Amanullah, who brought out a constitution of Afghanistan in 1923. His constitution called for equality of gender and opportunity across religions. It hurt the powerful clergy, who rose in revolt, and one faction led by a Tajik ethnic leader captured Kabul. Amanullah then abdicated the throne instead of making an attempt to seize back the control of Kabul. After a brief struggle for succession, Amanullah's distant cousin Muhammad Nadir Shah seized power in Afghanistan in 1929. He continued Amanullah's Soviet-inspired policies, but he was assassinated 4 years later. The last princely ruler was his son Zahir Shah, who ruled from 1933 to 1973 and saw Afghanistan through the periods of World War II and the initial decades of the Cold War. He was only 19 when he became the ruler of Afghanistan. He tried to emulate the progressive ideas of communist Soviet Russia. His reign saw several prime ministers, but 2 are considered to have contributed to the rise of Taliban as a reactionary Islamic force. They were Shah Mahmud and Daud Khan. Shah Mahmud challenged the conservatives among religious leaders with his decisions of free elections, free press and a liberal parliament. He was ousted by Muhammad Daud Khan, supported by fundamentalist Islamists. Daud Khan copied the Soviet model of economy and military. It was during his tenure that Soviet Russia virtually came to rule Afghanistan in all policy decisions. Another man important in the story is Hafizullah Amin. He was the main organizer of the Saur Revolution in April 1978. He overthrew Mohammad Daoud Khan government and formed a pro-Soviet state based on socialist ideas. Being second-in-chief of the Democratic Republic, Amin soon became the regime's strongman. A growing personal struggle with General Secretary Taraki eventually led to Amin wresting power away, then successfully deposing him later, ordering his execution. But Amin's short-lived presidency featured controversies from beginning to the end. In December 1979, before Islamists could actually take over Afghanistan, Soviet Union sent its troops. America was also upset with Soviet over the way their people were humiliated in Vietnam and Ethiopia, and now it was time for revenge. By the late 1980s, it became clear that the Soviet Union was falling apart, and it was only a matter of time that the Soviets would withdraw from Afghanistan. In 1989, Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev signed a deal to withdraw forces from Afghanistan. Meanwhile, the real power in Afghanistan passed from Russians to the ISI. The US and Saudi Arabia remained behind the curtains, trying to control the Pakistani intelligence agency, which used both its masters to its advantage. The relief of Soviet exit soon turned into despair. Law and order broke down across the country. Abduction, loot, robbery, murder, and corruption prevailed. Against this backdrop, the students, or the Taliban, emerged as saviors in 1994. They had come from the madrasas of Afghanistan and Pakistan. Their leader was Mullah Muhammad Omar. He had the support of Osama bin Laden. Taliban means students. This is what the word means in Pashto. Pashto is the first language of an estimated 55% of Afghanistan's population. Today, the word Taliban refers to a dreaded Islamic outfit that has taken back control of Afghanistan. They enforce Sharia-based law as interpreted by their conservative beliefs in areas they progressively took under their control. The Taliban entered Kandahar amid public support with a promise to clean up the crime-ridden Afghan city. The reinforcement of Islamic belief was so influential that it covered territories at a very fast pace. In 2 years' time, the Taliban had seized the Afghan capital of Kabul from President Burhanuddin Rabbani's forces. By 1996, the Taliban had become a formidable force against the government in Afghanistan. However, their struggle for total control continued. Taliban fostered Islamic terror groups including Al-Qaeda of Osama bin Laden and anti-India terror outfits operating from Pakistan. One of them had hijacked an Indian passenger plane IC-814 in 1999 and flew it to Kandahar with Taliban security demanding the release of terrorists locked up in Indian jails. At the height of their power, the Taliban controlled 9/10 of Afghanistan. Before Osama bin Laden's Al-Qaeda carried out the 9/11 terror attacks in the US, killing about 3,000 people. The terror attack understandably evoked a blistering response from the US and its NATO allies, which was directed against Al-Qaeda, but the consequent invasion rooted out the Taliban from Afghanistan for 20 years. The Taliban had rejected the US's demand to hand over Osama bin Laden over terrorist activities. UN sanctions increased on the Taliban between 1999 and 2001 for harboring and training terrorists. Even Islamic countries like Iran opposed the Taliban over its treatment of Shia Muslims. The Taliban sustained its economy via narcotics, smuggling and terror funding. But the 9/11 attacks brought the US-led NATO forces to Afghanistan's Bagram airbase after the Taliban again rejected the demand to extradite Osama bin Laden. The US landed in Afghanistan in October. By mid-December 2001, the Taliban were fleeing from their strongholds, including Kandahar. Hamid Karzai had earlier been chosen as interim president in 2001 itself. He won majority in the 2004 presidential election, in which women got the right to vote. Hamid Karzai's father and grandfather had served the Zahir Shah government, which had seen a major transformation in Afghanistan. He had become a choice for Afghan president as he had reached out to the authorities in the US against the Taliban. His views were known to the American authorities. His election seemed to bring an end to the Taliban in Afghanistan. But the US were determined to stay in Afghanistan till they found Osama bin Laden and secure an Afghan future that suited their geostrategic game. 10 years after US forces landed in Afghanistan, Osama bin Laden was found and killed in a night raid by special commandos. The catch was Osama was not in Afghanistan. He was in Pakistan's garrison town of Abbottabad in 2011. By the end of 2018, the US was firmly committed to completing a pullout, putting the Afghan government of President Ashraf Ghani under pressure of a resurgent Taliban. The Donald Trump administration was determined to bring its soldiers back from Afghanistan. A deal was signed between the US and the Taliban in February 2020 following several rounds of negotiations in Qatar. The US and NATO were to withdraw troops from Afghanistan in a time-bound manner. Around the time the US and the Taliban signed a peace deal, the group was in control of about 20% of over 400 districts of Afghanistan. In contrast, the government forces controlled about 33% of the districts. In the rest of Afghan territories, there was a contest between the government and the Taliban. Recently, the Taliban claimed to have about 85% of the Afghan territories under its control. This is close to what it had in 2001 before the US invaded Afghanistan. It has captured Afghanistan with about 55,000 fighters, more than it had in 1996 when it first seized the country. And of course, we also on 15th August 2021, when Taliban took control of Kabul, the capital of Afghanistan. While a peaceful transfer of power has been sought by Taliban on the face of it, indicators of a return to regressive barbarity have been witnessed in big cities, and the fate of people of Afghanistan remains in the balance.